I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. Today, I have a conversation with Lauren Leader Chivee. She is the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, a non-partisan women's organization committed to advancing women's political, civic, and professional leadership in America. She's also written a book titled Crossing the Thinnest Line, How Embracing Diversity from the Office to the Oscars Makes America Stronger. In it, she recounts some of her own experiences with exclusion growing up. She also argues that America's companies and institutions underperform both financially and creatively when they don't bring diverse voices like that of women and racial minorities to the table. In our conversation, Lauren explains how her own personal experiences have shaped her thinking and have led her to a career in advocating for women to have fair representation in business and government. So without further ado, here is Lauren Leader Chivee. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
So you've written a book and it's titled Crossing the Thinnest Line, How Embracing Diversity from the Office to the Oscars Makes America Stronger. And you open the book by describing some early experiences you had in grade school and in middle school that kind of shaped your career and your professional life. And one of the things that stood out to me was this experience where your parents moved you to a more exclusive school. And you described feeling the sting of exclusion, I think your words were, around a birthday party. So what happened there?
Well, so thanks for having me, first of all. And
Sure.
yeah, I told this story in the book really to say, and I will tell you the story, but I tell the story in the book because I do think that there are certain kinds of life experiences that are so transformative that they really change the way people see a whole range of issues. And for me, that was the experience of being excluded and excluded for something I couldn't control. In the book, I tell the story of my seventh grade classmate's birthday party. And it was a new school. And I was it turned out, the only girl in my class who was not invited to this party. And it turns out when I found out the reason, or at least my mother explained to me what she believed the reason was that the party was being held at a very exclusive country club in the Washington, D.C. suburbs that still excluded Jews in 1988 when I was in the seventh grade. And, whether or not that was true, I'll never really know. But that experience of feeling that I had been excluded for something that I could not control, that was just who I was so shocking and humiliating. And it really gave me a very different experience or a very different understanding of what it feels like to be an outsider. And, I do think that for Americans who have had outsider experiences or who have been able to connect with a sense of empathy for those who have, there is a very important differentiated view of the world. And I will say that I think, even in the time since I wrote the book, I believe that more now than ever, whether that's around immigration issues or issues of race and gender in this country. We need more Americans to connect on a very deep level with a sense of empathy for the experience of others. And I do think that often comes from these personal experiences.
Right. It often does. And so I wanted to follow up because after that, you were moved to a different school, right, where your experience was a bit better and it was more liberal and it was more diverse, where you had other pivotal moments that kind of shaped your thinking around diversity and around having empathy for others, right?
Yeah. And, the school it wasn't just that it was liberal, it was that they had made this deep and lasting commitment to social justice and to empowering students, high school students particularly, with a sense of awareness and understanding of the world around them, and particularly of race issues. The school I went to, a school called Georgetown Day School, was established as the first integrated school in Washington in 1948 at a time when Washington, D.C., which was below the Mason-Dixon line, was a deeply segregated city. And they had made this commitment to educating both white and Black children at a time when that was really revolutionary. And so by the time that I got there in high school in 1989 or 1990, they were continuing that commitment. And going to a diverse school, I deeply believe that being in diverse school settings is enormously important for kids, white and Black, minority, majority. But it's not enough just to throw people together. What was so extraordinary about my academic experience was that the school was willing to recognize that there were conflicts that were inevitable from putting together a lot of really different kids. And they were willing to invest in helping us work through those conflicts. In the ninth grade, classes were suspended for several days, and they brought in Juan Williams, who had just written Eyes on the Prize,
Right.
to facilitate discussions on race. I mean, it was extraordinary, and I'm really eternally grateful for that experience.
That is really extraordinary. When I read that, Juan Williams wasn't invited to my high school. So
yeah, I don't think he gets invited to. I saw him recently, by the way. It's very funny. I saw him at the RNC last year, and I stopped him and I told him about that experience, and he remembered it and said that it was really transformative for him too. So, yeah.
Really?
A footnote on history.
I can't help but think of, we're both Gen Xers and think about that time, in the late 80s and 90s. I can't help but think of John Hughes movies and about, class divisions.
When I watch them now, I mean, those movies are entirely white.
They are.
Like, you literally never see a face of color in those movies. I watched them again recently, and it's astonishing. And look, that period too, keep in mind, it was really before a lot of the gay rights movement, which is so part of our daily lives,
right.
Happened. And so there were a lot of kids in my class, and I'm sure there were for you too, who were, profoundly closeted and, really struggling with their identities. So, it was a real turning point in the country around consciousness around a lot of these issues.
No, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that you described that I can relate to, and I try to describe it to people here in Seattle. I live in Seattle, but I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, where, like DC, there were these entire pockets of African Americans that were that weren't necessarily poor. They were middle class and upper middle class and even wealthy, but they still dealt with segregation and still dealt with racism. And I think it's relevant in that a part of the work that needs to be done is for people who are in a position to lead efforts in diversity at companies and institutions, that they understand the complexity of America's racial fabric, that Black people and racial minorities come from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. That doesn't mean that we can stop advocating for these groups in the more subtle ways that, they experience this discrimination, professionally and, with representation in government.
Well, look, I mean, the fact that as a white American, I grew up with Black Americans and, had close relationships with people of different races is already unusual. I mean, the sad truth is that our nation remains very deeply segregated geographically and socially and racially. Cities have for a long time been the exception to that. And I think in many ways, it's why you see particularly so many young Americans moving into cities. They actually are drawn to the diversity of big cities. And I say in the book, young Americans have been voting with their feet on these issues. But for folks of our generation, and frankly, for most of the country, that's a really unusual experience. And it's why, by the way, I do talk about media as one of the dimensions of what I think is so important in advancing diversity in the country, because for many Americans, what they watch on television is actually their only exposure to people of different races and cultures. And you look at the impact that shows like Ellen had on the gay rights movement. I mean, you really can't, or frankly now Wonder Woman, you really can't overstate how important media is in this discussion, because so few Americans, unfortunately, ever really get personal connection to people who are very different from them.
Right. And you also talk about your family and how you were the first in your family to intermarry culturally and religiously. And then following that, you adopted 2 biracial African-American daughters. And I'm just curious about how your experiences in middle school and in high school kind of shaped your thinking around that decision. Do you think that you were in a better position given what you'd experienced?
I mean, I will say it was not a tough decision for me.
Yeah.
It was something that was very clear for me that it was what I wanted to do. I didn't set out to adopt minority children. I just wanted to adopt healthy, beautiful children that were meant to be my kids. And that is what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, my second child, I will say that I definitely made more of a conscious decision to try to seek out a birth mother that was going to have a African-American or biracial child, because I didn't want my older daughter to be the only Black child in my family. When we were ready to have the second child, it was a more conscious decision. But, look, I do not in any way suppose that I have any more insight or knowledge than anyone else. Race, will always be a complex subject in our family, and it is a complex subject generally. But I do feel some sense that, as someone who spends so much time thinking about and working on these issues, I hope I handle them well. And I write about in the book that, even, as the mother of minority kids, I've had to face my own barriers and biases. And I write a lot about the sort of surprise that I had when I realized when my daughter at the time, who was, I guess, about 3 at the time, came home from preschool and sort of announced that she was brown. And really like in this very matter of fact way, but it was the first time that I heard her say anything conscious about her looking different from me. And my gut reaction was that I wanted to change the subject. It was like a split second reaction. It wasn't that I, really was afraid of it, but I had this like, sort of pushback in a sense internally. And then I realized in researching the book, how important it is to talk about race with our children, black or white, by the way, that if you avoid the subject or change the subject, our children actually draw a negative conclusion. I'm glad that at the time I had the, wherewithal to actually then have a conversation with my daughter, which was very simple and straightforward. I mean, she was 3. Yes, you're brown and mom is white, and that's because you were not in my belly. And so you look different from me. And we've had obviously many more, somewhat more sophisticated conversations since she's still only 8. But these are topics that I think every American needs to get comfortable talking about. We need more white Americans talking about race. We need all Americans talking about this stuff and with real curiosity and a desire to learn from one another.
I actually kind of have similar experiences. I have a biracial son, but, I've had those same questions from my son. And I think, if I remember correctly from your book, I first of all, I had the same instinct to change the subject. And it's always a really difficult conversation to have, especially in a situation where you have one black parent and one white parent, and you're trying to explain those differences. And there's no one in the family who can completely relate to the experience from either side. And I think in our case, to just kind of focus on the beauty of those differences. But yeah, those are really tough conversations, and then we get into, just other racial conversations, about being, black in America. And that's, that opens up a whole other can of worms. I mean, I guess the point is that you talk about this concept of acquired diversity, right? And I think this is a good example. So what is acquired diversity?
A lot of the legacy of even just the word diversity or the way that the associations that we all make with diversity, a lot of that comes from the Equal Rights Opportunity Commission and the requirements that came out of, Title IX and other federal legislation barring discrimination on the basis of a number of protected classes. And so we're used to thinking about diversity as do you qualify as one of those classes? Are you female? Are you black? Are you Hispanic? Are you Asian? Are you a veteran? Are you disabled? These are the categories that have been sort of set forth. But the reality is obviously far more complicated than that. There are lots of people like you and like my kids who have, all kinds of different identities. And the downside of discussing diversity in terms of those protected classes is also that it, in many cases, leaves out folks who may not look diverse, but who bring some other kind of atypical experience, let's say, not majority experience that also has meaning and value. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that there are lots of people who have had those kinds of exclusionary experiences, for instance, that I talked about at the beginning, that have shaped their views, that they have an ability to empathize with and understand the outsider experience that's important. That deserves recognition. So a number of years ago, we sort of landed on this idea of acquired diversity, the sense that you could have life experiences that so expand your horizons and your ability to empathize with others and to understand that outsider experience that it deserves to be recognized. And what I've found is that, particularly the white men who I have encountered who, in no way look diverse or would not, we wouldn't think of them in that way, but who have had those kinds of really powerful and formative outsider experiences, they behave differently and they behave in ways that are more inclusive and that are important for the country. And so, the term maybe isn't that valuable, except to say we do need to recognize the important contribution that people make to inclusion, even if they don't look like the usual champions.
Well, the thing is that what you've described as acquired diversity often happens by accident, but it's really useful when someone has those experiences. But it's not something that you can force. Is there a way that we can proactively seek this for a greater segment of society?
Well, I think we need to work to nurture and facilitate these kinds of life experiences. I mean, I do think it comes from a lot of different things. I mean, I think there are certainly, I have stories in the book about, the CEO who grew up extremely poor and felt like didn't fit in and felt like an outsider. And so has a real sense of empathy for the working poor in a way that's been really important in his business, and stories of people who've lived in other countries and who've had that experience and learned from it. But I also think it comes from some really deep personal and very human connections. And I tell the story in the book of my colleagues from Deloitte who, spend their time doing prison ministry, and the experience of connecting with largely minority inmates has really changed their lives and changed the way that they see others and see the people around them. And so we need to focus on how we develop empathy and build these relationships for children in school, all the way through, frankly, adults. There's never been, you look at what's happened in the country over the last year. Even since my book came out, I can't think of anything more urgent and imperative in the country today than helping Americans develop a deeper sense of understanding and empathy for one another across lines of race and culture and gender and everything else.
So you talk about how your experiences kind of shaped your career, and you ultimately moved into HR, where you fought for maternity leave and for equity for women and their male peers, right? And you described one experience where you were fighting for equal maternity leave for women in senior positions and for women who were in secretarial positions. And when I read that, I thought, why? Why would anyone think that that was a good idea? So can you explain what happened and in the thinking behind the decision to give women in executive positions more maternity leave?
So the United States is the only country in the world, except for Papua New Guinea and, maybe there's one other, that does not offer or that does not guarantee paid leave or family reasons. And I don't want to just say maternity, because it's more than that. It's also, for caregiving and other critical needs, but obviously maternity is a critical part of this. So the reality is that since 1993 and the passage of the Family Medical Leave Act, which guarantees one's job but no pay, companies large and small have had to try to come to terms with what they should do. And it's expensive. It means that companies are paying salary continuation for women who are out on maternity leave. And many companies over the years have done a calculation which says, well, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do it for the people who matter most. I might not offer such a generous benefit to people who matter less. And the reality is that unfair as that sounds, there's no legal barrier to companies doing that. Big corporations have come around, and there's been enormous progress in terms of paid family leave in terms of the biggest companies in America. There's also been some paid family leave statutes in a couple of states. But, the vast majority of Americans have no paid leave. And that means that for poorer women, for women who are at the lower end of the economic scale, it's really, in many cases, a choice between extreme poverty and having a child. And the vast majority of Americans agree it's a completely unfair burden and an unfair choice. But we've been unwilling as a country to really coalesce around an issue as basic as this. I do think it's also part of why we're seeing the decline in the labor force participation of women, which is that countries that have the highest labor force participation are also the countries that have invested in supports for working women, like paid family leave, like subsidized childcare,
Right.
And on and on. And the United States has just consistently abandoned any efforts to make that possible. And so, family leave is one of those issues which, the wealthy Americans are fine because they generally either can afford to cover it or they work for companies that give them leave. But for hourly workers, for poor Americans, this is a massive burden and one that we have been we've basically been unwilling to deal with.
Right. So I just want to play devil's advocate for a minute, because I live in Seattle, where there are lots of tech companies. We have Amazon, we have Google, we have Microsoft here. And, I've seen it firsthand. I've spent a good portion of my career in technology. So, companies here and the technology companies generally in the US have done really well. And they also generally they don't have stellar records on diversity, both gender and racial diversity. Right. So what do you say to those companies and to those executives who say that we've done pretty well without putting an emphasis in investing and making our companies more diverse when we can still be profitable?
Well, look, I don't think you would hear that argument from any senior executives at the big tech companies. I think they all totally appreciate it. And when you look at the kinds of investments that big tech,
not publicly,
right? Look, I don't think the problem is the CEOs of big tech companies. Okay. I don't think that's the issue. I think that the problem is the willingness of companies, and particularly I think of in the startup world, in the venture-backed world, to actually hold people accountable and make the hard decisions that are required in order to hold fast to those principles. I mean, there are endless examples of companies where, you hear the right thing at the top and the wrong thing is happening in the organization. And I'm not going to start naming all the tech companies. I mean, we've all heard this. I mean, I do not in any way, I'll just use Google, I guess, as one example. I don't in any way question the commitment of Google executives to diversity. I think it's sincere. I think it's real. They've been doing this for a long time. They're deeply invested in it. They spend a lot of money on it. They put a lot of resources against it. But for a company that's now, 30,000 employees or more, how do you actually hold people in the trenches accountable on a day-to-day basis? It's a harder thing to do. And I think companies have to be willing to do that. And to your point, when you're profitable and successful, I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? When you're profitable and successful, it's hard to necessarily compel people because they don't see the benefit. And when you're not profitable and successful, it's hard to compel people because you're so worried about other things. But these are really deep systemic issues. Look, the reality is that the biases that exist that people hold don't suddenly disappear when they walk into work in the morning. I mean, and we act like they do. We have acted as if somehow the workplace is this environment where, the woes of the world, stop at the front door. And that's just not true. There are deep societal issues that surround a lot of our biases that are much bigger issues than what any one company can solve. But I do also think the seriousness with which the tech industry needs to take this challenge, there's still a lot of work to do.
So Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, you're talking about a conference that you were both at, and she posed a question about how do you close the gender gap? And she used all of the arguments about, the economic gains that we'd have if we could close the pay gap with women and minorities. And you talked about some of the responses that you heard from the attendees at the conference. Did you find those disheartening?
Well, so yeah, for a little context, I mean, it was the three Treasury secretaries at the time. It was Geithner, Rubin, and Paulson. So these are the three sort of trustees of our economic prosperity, or at least were at the time. And when Sheryl asked that question about what we could do to really unleash the economic power of women, none of them really had an answer. And I thought that was shocking. The countries where leaders have taken this challenge seriously have seen enormous benefits from it. And the reverse is also true. And I talk in the book about the example of Japan, which has had a really protracted recession, largely in part due to the low labor force participation of women, which has been such a drag. The prime minister has taken it on as one of his primary goals to try to turn that around. I worry very much that the United States may head in that direction. If we continue to underinvest in kinds of supports and resources that we need in order to enable women to fully contribute to our economy, we are missing out. And all the data shows that we're missing out on trillions of dollars of economic growth. Ensuring that women have access to capital to start businesses, ensuring that women have the kinds of workplace supports that they need to stay in the workforce instead of dropping out, holding companies accountable on pay equity issues, ensuring minimum wage is addressed because the 70% of minimum wage workers in this country are women, protecting some of the kinds of industries that women have historically dominated, like nursing and home healthcare and teaching and other industries that have disproportionately had women, and making sure that those are well-paying industries where women are supported. I mean, all of those things, it's not just a nice to do. All the data shows that it would add $5 trillion or 3% GDP to the American economy. So I do think, obviously, look, this is not a time politically where I think this is going to be a priority. We have a president who's made it pretty clear, especially after the recent reversal of the Obama administration's order on equal pay. This is not an administration that cares about this. For the long-term health of the American economy, these are big issues that we need to tackle. And I'd like to see more of our political and financial leaders take this seriously.
So whose responsibility is it ultimately, right? I mean, so in the case that you've described, you stood up for women in the maternity leave example. Should we as women be standing up to the leadership in companies and government to demand equal pay?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. I mean, look, it doesn't happen by accident. I mean, again, back to some of the examples of countries around the world, people talk a lot about Iceland and the Nordic countries. it's not an accident that those countries are places where there is such extraordinary, better gender parity than almost anywhere on earth. It's not an accident because the women in those countries mobilized en masse politically. They got women elected, they held their political leaders accountable, and they demanded the kinds of equality and treatment that they were looking for. Women do vote and they outvote men, and we've outvoted men in almost every election since 1980. But then we largely opt out of the rest of the political process. And that is, in fact, why I started All In Together, which we haven't talked about yet, but is my nonprofit that works to educate women on civics and political leadership. Until women start to really mobilize and hold leaders accountable, both in business and in politics, I worry that we are not going to see the kind of progress that I know most women support. And a lot of these things are very bipartisan issues. A vast majority of women on both sides of the aisle support paid family leave. Vast majority of women on both sides of the aisle support equal pay for women and for enhancing equal pay legislation. So, even though those solutions might look a little different from one side of the aisle to the next, but unless we have more women elected and more women showing up and holding their leaders accountable in our political process, I fear that we're not going to see much change.
Right. So you mentioned your organization, All In Together. So how does All In Together fit into this mission?
So All In Together is a nonpartisan, nonprofit education organization, and we run programs all over the country to teach women the tools of civic leadership and political participation and empowerment. And, at a time when there are a lot of very high emotions on both sides about what's happening in our political process, and lots of Americans are asking, what can I do to make my voice heard? That's really what we do, is we teach women how to do that. And, we really believe that our entire democracy benefits from the full participation of women. We're over 50% of the American population, but we're vastly underrepresented in the halls of power. And some of that is in our own hands. And so we work to try to give women the opportunity and the tools and the guidance to help them do that.
Right. So I want to mention that this organization is nonpartisan, right? You work with both conservative and liberal women to achieve this. But I want to play devil's advocate again. One of the cornerstones of the conservative movement is the limiting of access to reproductive services and birth control. The statistics around that, when women have limited access to reproductive services and can't control their family size, or they can't participate in family planning, their careers suffer, right? And their professional lives suffer. So how do you reconcile this fact with the assertion that this should be a nonpartisan effort and that, conservative women should be brought into the feminist tent?
My fundamental belief is that if you believe in democratic participation, if you believe that it is important that women be represented in our democracy, you have to believe that even if you don't agree with every woman all the time. In other words, you can't just say, I believe in democracy, but only for the people I agree with. That's anathema. That is fundamentally in opposition to the core tenets of democracy, which is representation of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that means all the people. So I feel that it would be hypocritical of me to run an organization that was exclusively focused on training women that I agreed with. I also want to be really clear that All In Together doesn't take political positions. So we don't tell women what policies we think they should fight for, or what we think they should believe in or work to advance. What we say to women is whatever matters to you, whatever is the issue that you're most passionate about, speak up, step up, and do something. And so there's not a contradiction there. My personal views on some of the more divisive issues are really not relevant. What I want is women to participate fully. And again, you have to be willing to do that, even with women you don't agree with. That is the fundamental principle of democracy at play. Now, I do think that there are a whole range of issues in this country that, like abortion, which are so divisive that they have really undermined women's political power. And those dividing lines, that bright red line on abortion rights between the parties, is one of the reasons why we see such low participation of women in politics, because we're constantly asking women to put that issue in the center of their political participation. And it's one of many important issues. So my only point is that I do appreciate that for liberal women, that is, a critical division, but I also, and for conservative women as well. But I also think we have an obligation in this country to ensure we have representative democracy and full participation of all of our citizens. And that's our mission.
So how do we convince the people in our lives who have power and privilege? You make a point about straight white men in positions of power or positions of privilege kind of leading some of these efforts. How do we convince them that this is needed?
I think that's the $1,000,000 question. We all have a responsibility to have, thoughtful, open conversations and to try to help others understand where we're coming from. I don't think we're going to convince everyone, but I'm very encouraged by the trends. I do think that younger Americans and younger American men, overwhelmingly have much more inclusive views of women, of people of color. There's data that measures that. There's a generational shift that's also at play. The more men that are, married to women that are working and have daughters, et cetera, that is, slowly but surely changing attitudes about the full participation of women in our society. And the more our communities diversify and Americans of all races and backgrounds begin to live and work with each other in more substantial ways, the more people's views and attitudes will change. And I've seen that. I've seen real change and in the attitudes of some of the folks that I've worked with over the years. And so I know it's possible. It's going to take some sustained and meaningful effort.
Well, Lauren Leader Chivee, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me.